let's get started. My name is Jason Bock. I'm a staff software engineer at Rocket Mortgage, and my talk in this session is what's new in C#. Here's a little bit of information about myself. If you want to visit any one of these sites, I do have a YouTube channel. Like I said before, you don't have to like it. Please subscribe though. I would really appreciate that. So if you have any questions during this talk, feel free just to raise your hand, get my attention. This isn't a fast focus, so I do have more time and I can be a little bit more flexible. All of the code examples that I'm going to show on my demos, which most of this talk is going to be on, is at this GitHub repository. So if you want to take a look at it and peruse that code, feel free to do so. There is one caveat, and I'll explain this when I get to the demo, is that depending on the state of the code that I actually set main to whenever I commit this stuff, it may either compile or not, and that may sound weird, but when I show you the demo, I'll explain why, and that will make sense. So if you get it and it doesn't compile, you might go, why is your demo code not working? There's a specific reason why, okay? So just keep that in mind. But if you want to take a look at the code, go ahead and go to this repository and get it there. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on language evolution and how C# has changed over the years. Most of the time is going to be focused on modern features, and I actually want to stress off the bat that this is not just purely about what's new in C# 14, okay? I purposely titled this talk this way because I don't just want to be limited to the latest version. There's a lot of good stuff that's come into C# over the years, and in recent history especially, that you may not have heard or picked up on. So I want to make sure that I'm focusing on like what is the latest and greatest in recent history, not just the latest version. Okay, so we're going to go through a bunch of those features and then a call to action at the end. All right, so language evolution. It's really weird to see that this language is older than my kids, that it's been around that long. Its first version came out in 2002, and who used it at that point? Yeah, okay, we got some people that have used the language for that long of a time, and if you haven't, that's okay. I mean, as we're going to show, the change of the language in one way has stayed constant, but in another way you can do things that don't look anything like what you did when you started. C# has been pretty much my language throughout my entire career. I've been doing this for over 30 years now, and for good, bad, or indifferent, I have pretty much been with Microsoft Technologies throughout my career. And I started in VB, and then I started hearing about this thing called .NET and C#, and what was that? And I was fortunate to start getting some beta bits with C#, even before this was released. And ever since then, I've been pretty much programming in C#, along with some other languages. But this is the one I really know the most. And it's not perfect. No language is except Perl, okay? I'm glad I got a laugh out of that. Sometimes I do that at conferences and people are like, what's Perl? You know, so that's good. Every language has idiosyncrasies. Every language makes you sometimes go, why this but not this? But it is a language I know very well. So it's now in 24 years of history of being released. And as you can imagine, with a language being around that long, it has to evolve or it's going to die. So one thing I did is I took a look, and again, this might be a little bit hard to see. You can get the slides and take a look at them on your own machine or phone or whatever if you'd like. But I wanted to put together a history of how many features were added to each version of the language and when was that version released. Now, this is a numbers game like lines of code, which in some ways is absolutely meaningless. You know, I produced 10,000 lines of code. I can have a prompt do that these days. I mean, that's not impressive. So I'm not trying to show a number here to say one is more important than the other. Some features have a very, very small impact and are very focused on one specific area. Another feature like link in and of itself, which was in C#3, had other features to support it, and those are widely used within the language. Okay, but it's a numbers game to just kind of give you a feel for how the language evolution has accelerated over time. And if you see this wall of numbers, it might be hard to pick out what I'm getting at, but I'm going to put a line in here between version 5 and version 6, because that was a big change, and not just in C#, but in the entire world of .NET. Okay, and that change was something called Roslyn. So before C#6, The compiler for C# was not written in C#. It was written primarily in C++, a little bit of C, maybe a little bit of assembly, but primarily unmanaged languages and not C# in and of itself. And typically languages, they kind of want to eat their own dog food. So you want to compile the language in the language. There's a lot of advantages if you do that. And they wanted to do that from the get-go, but as you probably have experienced yourself, sometimes schedules slip, price pressure comes into play, and you can't do everything you want within a certain scoped amount of time. So they just couldn't get, long story short, they couldn't get to it. But ever since then, they wanted to do that, especially since they were also facing this conundrum of the compiler and what was in Visual Studio at the time to parse your code were not the same code bases. So that was becoming problematic over and over with time as more and more features were added. So they started to work on this thing called Project Rosalind. And if you remember way back in the day with Microsoft, they had their own conference, PDC, and you'd see Anders Heilsberg. He was like the father of C#, you could consider that. And he would mention real quick at the end of a talk that they're working on this compiler as a service. Eventually, they mentioned that, yes, we are building a new compiler for C# called it Project Rosalind. And finally, in 2015, version 6 is the one that it uses this new compiler, and it's been that way ever since. One of the things, though, also with Rosalind and with what Microsoft was doing with .NET is it made it all open source. So the version 6 was released in 2015. In 2014, they announced Project Rosalind Compiler as a Service, which is officially called the Compiler API, was going to be released open source on what they used to have something called Codeplex, if you remember that. And then eventually they moved it to GitHub like everybody else in the universe has done. So, but they made this open source. And that was a huge switch from the world that Microsoft was, which was generally very hostile to open source, to now embracing it. Doing this effectively made almost everything, if not everything, become open source. The tide changed completely with just this one decision, okay? So it's historically very significant. And as you see, this impact has also changed the evolution of the language because now people can contribute to it. Doesn't mean that anybody in this room can just say, hey, I have this really fancy syntax that I want to add to C#, so I'm going to go in, add a PR, change it, and they'll accept it. I guarantee you they won't. They still put a lot of effort into making sure that new features have the value, not just for one person, but for the entire C# community. Okay? But also it being open source, people can contribute with fixing some bugs or adding little performance improvements, both in the language and in .NET as a whole. I'm doing a talk tomorrow on performance in .NET, and I'm going to talk about that one thing as well in the presentation. So that's another thing that's really cool about this all being open source. And so I took that data and I said, okay, well, let's actually look at the feature count and see on the bottom, that's the month and year of when all these things were released. And again, here's that inflection point to where we got to having Rosalind in play. And if you crunch the numbers, what you see is before Rosalind, there was 52 features in 10.5 years. And now after Rosalind, including 14, which just came out in November, we have 135 features in 10.5 years. So we've gone to, again, these are just rough, what are the three lies in the world? There's lies, damn lies, and statistics, right? So, this is a lot of potential hand waving, and I get that, but just take it for a very high level view of the language evolution. 5 features a year before, and now we're getting 13 features a year. The pace has accelerated a lot, and maybe you've felt that, and maybe you've had opinions on that as a C# developer. It's interesting because for so long, there was this C# and .NET is not moving fast enough. All these kids are using JavaScript and Ruby and all these other languages, and they're just banging apps out left, right, and center. And C# just feels like this old and crusty language that old people like me use, And I think that was true. I think for a while there was this. It wasn't able to keep up with what people wanted to do in languages and programming in general. And it's almost reversed now. Now I hear people complain about it's moving too fast. I can't keep up. There's too much going on. And I don't know, when I look at some code that's been written with these new features, I don't know what ... this thing bracket means anymore, you know? And I think there's a truth on both sides of these views. So how does somebody keep up in C#? What do you do these days to make sure that you can have some semblance of these new features that are there? Part of it is just study. I think if you want to be effective at a language, even in this world of glorious AI, it's still important to understand how these things work. And I'll talk about that later on at the end of the talk as well. Like, we have AI, so do I really care? I'll address that later on. But I think if you want to understand anything, obviously, you need to study it. And with programming languages, I've found that I can read pretty much any program that's written in a language, even if I don't know what that language is, except Perl, because nobody can. But if it's in Ruby, or if it's in Python, or if it's in something else, I generally get the gist of it. Okay? And with tools like Copilot, you can ask it, hey, what does this code do? And more or less, it's going to do a reasonable job of giving you a summary of it, unless it went off completely the rails, which we can all do as humans, right? So it helps, though, to study, because it's one thing to read it, it's another thing to actually know how to be effective in that language. I believe it takes some time to become really fluent in a particular programming language so that you can feel very confident and just create code, even if it's being generated for you, that you understand what it's doing, okay? And there's tools, not just the AI tools, but there's tools within Visual Studio, and I'm going to show this in the demo, that can make it easier to transition from how you did something in potentially older way, which is still valid, still going to work, but now you have this new feature and that you might want to change to in your code. Okay? And those things get lit up in Visual Studio and you can see them and let it do all the work for you. And then you can discover all these new features that way. All right, so now I'm going to jump into a bunch of demos and go through some of these changes, not just in C#, but also the SDK and the tooling around it, because I think that's important as well. If you haven't seen some of these things I'm about to show you, it can also make your life easier in handling projects where you're using C# and making sure all of your packages are updated and consistent, okay? So I'm going to go into here into Visual Studio 2026. Has everybody upgraded? Anybody now? Okay, somebody's shaking their head, and I appreciate the honesty. Good. And I'm not selling up here because, one, I don't work for Microsoft, and two, even by saying this, I'm not getting any money. But I say this as what I feel is a truism. I think 2026 is far better than anything they've done previously. That's, again, just my opinion, but I can visually see it being faster compared to what was there before. So out of just that and that alone, that has saved me time, okay? So I would highly encourage you that if you haven't upgraded to 2026, I would do it. It's made my life even that much better, okay? So that's what I've got here. And you can see with the code, there's already like, oh my God, he's got some red squiggles everywhere. Unless you're colorblind, and I apologize. Just trust me that this code here has a red squiggle and this code has a red squiggle, okay? And red squiggles are bad, those mean errors. I'm gonna talk about why in a moment. But I've done this on purpose. This is what I meant by if you get the code from the repository and you compile it and it's wrong, please don't send me a pull request or just tell me that I suck. I mean, okay, I get that. But it's bad on purpose because we're gonna go through and change it and highlight features as we go along and do that, okay? But before we do that, some of the things I wanna show you will explain why you see some of these things popping up, and it has to do with other files that affect C# within Visual Studio. The first one is more of just a nice bookkeeping thing, but if you didn't know, the solution file itself, has anybody ever looked at an SLN file in a text editor? Do you love it? If anybody says yes, we're gonna have words, okay? because it sucks. It's horrible. It's awful. And you can say, well, I would never edit a solution file. And it's like, yeah, in part because the format sucks. It was based on like a sort of any file format that had all these GUIDs in it that you had no idea what they meant and had no hope of just, if I just actually wanted to type in or edit a solution file, God help you. There's just no way, okay? So what they have now is something called an SLNX file. And you can't open it here in Visual Studio. Like if I double click on the project, that's my project file. You may also be saying, why do you have one line as your project file? I'll get to that in a moment. But you can edit that, and you can do, a lot of times I'm editing my project file directly in Visual Studio. You know, the old SDK format is long gone. This new one is much better. And this solution file format is much better. That's the solution file for my demo project. So it's XML, which some of you may hate and go, why didn't they make it JSON? But it's XML. To me, that's fine. They're both fine. But it's so much easier to read this and go, what is actually in my solution? What are my projects? What files do I have referenced in my solution? Much, much better. It's a small thing, but it's a nice thing. And if you need, or not need, because you don't need to do this, but I'd highly recommend upgrading to SNLX. And you may go, well, how do I do that? .NET solution, the name of your solution file, migrate. And it'll make an SLNX file for you, and you're done. So that's a tool that's available for you at the command line if you want to do that. So to convert them is actually very, very easy. Okay, so that's solution files. Now, if I go into my project, again, I showed you that there's really nothing in there. It's just the project element. And the reason why, in part, is because what I do on my projects is I have this file here called the directory build props file. If you don't use this, oh, yes, go ahead. Does MS Build support that? Yes. So what would be required? You have to have a version of MS Build that supports it. So when this came out like last year sometime, and so if you look at the documentation, it will tell you you need to use a version of MS Build to support SLNX, but it does. So this is not a Visual Studio only feature. It will work in Writer, it will work in VS Code, Visual Studio, command line builds, everything. Okay. So good question. So directory build props files. I use them for every solution that I have because if I open that up, that's where all my project settings are. So every project within my solution uses these settings, okay? So for example, if I want to target .NET 10, like I'm doing here, every project does. If the project wants to override it for whatever reason, then you can set that in the csproj file, and that takes precedence. Okay. If I had a couple things in here like no warn, which is a way to say stop yelling at me for warnings about stuff, and I put in like that, which I'm going to take out because I don't want to do that. A csproj file can put in and say, well, I want to have the ones that are already in scope plus, other ones as well. So you can define some of those things. The point of this file is you can put in how I want my projects configured, and all of them will get that setting. That's really, really nice. So to upgrade to like 11, which that's going to happen at the end of this year, all I have to do is literally change one character, and all of them are going to get it. Okay. Another thing to notice in this file is, I actually don't have that set here, I should, is use artifacts output. Let's live dangerously. I usually do this now. For some reason, I forgot to put it in this one. But what artifacts, I might actually take it out because it might screw up some of the build that's going to happen. But I would highly recommend use artifacts output, because what that's going to do is all those bin and obj folders that you might see in your project folders are now put into an artifacts folder. So it pulls all of them out and puts it in one place. It's much easier to handle any of the results of your builds because it's all in one folder. I'm just going to take this out because I don't want that to mess anything up with my demos right now. Okay, I saw this morning, there's a new version of Visual Studio. Do you want to install it? No. I've got a demo to do this afternoon. I'm not doing that. And to be fair, updating Visual Studio has been really smooth for many years now. That's just my personal experience, but that's a truism for me. It's been very, very smooth, but I'm just not taking any chances when I want my machine to work and not have any problems, okay? So that's another thing to set is the artifacts option. The other one here, and this is in part why you're seeing some things in red, is this analysis mode to all. So there are compiler errors that you get, like if you forget a semicolon, you're gonna get a compiler error. There's other things that you do in C# that C# just won't let you compile that code. There's other things though that are warnings that it's gonna tell you, hey, you may really wanna do this for various reasons. And if you don't have this on, you're not gonna get any indication that you might wanna change your code for the better. And I would recommend you turn this on. I've actually used code analysis in .NET ever since the FXCop days, if you remember that tool. That's actually what evolved into what you see as code analysis now in C# and .NET as a whole. Okay? So you turn that on, you're gonna get more things lighting up that I think are actually beneficial and helpful so that your code can become that much better. Okay? But to notice some of these things, I think you also want to do this. Treat warnings as errors as true. Okay? Because warnings are errors that lack conviction. This gives it conviction. It will turn these into an error and it will stop your build. If you see a yellow light, what are you supposed to do? Speed up, yes. You know, if you see a red light, what are you supposed to do that most people in 2026 aren't doing anymore? Go faster. Okay. I've gotten into the habit these days, and yes, I'm getting to be an old grumpy man, but I'm getting into the habit of, even if I get a green light, I will now look both ways. Because I don't know how many times I've seen people literally blow red lights these days. It's ridiculous, you know. Well, it's probably not just an old man thing, but I'm getting older and crustier, and shaking the fist at the sky. So, but this is one of them. I would highly recommend doing this because I have found that yes, the first time you do this, you might see a sea of red, and you might panic and get angry and go, "Why would I ever want to address any of these things?" But if you do that, I think that's going to put your code in a much better state. You're going to learn things about your code that you didn't realize before, and that's going to actually teach you so that the next time you do things, you're going to either avoid that and or do things better the right way, okay? So I'd highly recommend turning that on as well. And one other setting is manage package versions centrally. What this does is it now makes sure that you have, or you should have, this directory packages props file. And that's another XML file that if I open it up, you'll see that any of my NuGet packages are here as package version elements. So this says that if a project, it doesn't force all the projects to reference these, but if a project references one of these packages, it's going to use this version. So it makes it seamless to keep, you never have to do that consolidate thing in Visual Studio again. It's always going to have every single one at the same version. And if you need a project, again, to override that for whatever reason, you can put the version number in the package reference. So if I go to my test project down here, you'll see that all my package references have no versions. But if I wanted one of them for whatever reason to go back a version for compatibility or something like that, I can just put that version there and that takes precedence. I mention all these files, even though they're not C# features specifically, but I think if you're writing a project or doing code in C# in 2026, I would highly recommend using them. They make things, it just makes your life better. Okay? So that's the stuff around C# to go through first. Let's back all that out, put that there. And now let's actually go to my person class. And like I said, there's lots of red here, and there's a lot of things that we're going to fix, and that'll illustrate some things that you can do now to potentially use some new features. First one is you see all these using statements up here, and I'll zoom in. You can kind of see they're grayed out. I usually don't use this, but when you're in light mode, you'll see that these are kind of grayed out. But there's a lot of them that are grayed out. even for types that I'm using within these namespaces, is because of one of those settings that I have up in my build props file, which is implicit usings enabled. This was in C# 10. So based on this, the SDK of your project, which is in this case is just the normal SDK, there are certain usings that it will bring in by default for you that are global, okay? So that you don't have to have those using statements within every single file. Okay? Now in Visual Studio, to get rid of this, and this is one keystroke that would there's a couple, I love using the keyboard in Visual Studio. Like when people move their mouse and they click a menu option and then they go down and they click this and then they move over here, and it's like, I don't have much time left. Okay, let's move here. Let's do things a little bit quicker. So I love to learn new keyboard bindings and things like that. One of them I would highly recommend is Control Period. Okay, because where your cursor is in the editor, it will show you things that you may want to consider at that point in your code. And so if I move over here, you'll see that I get remove unnecessary usings. And you might have seen this before, but notice down at the bottom here that I get the ability to say fix all occurrences in document, project, or solution. So if I ever want to change things, look for those options down at the bottom, because it's no longer oh my God, I got to change like all my namespaces and I got to do that in every file and it's going to take forever. I could just say solution and say, yep, if I can find my mouse pointer, apply, and it would do it to all the files in all my project to that solution. Okay, so code fixes, refactorings like that, look for that, because it can just make some changes that you want to do in your code base much quicker if those options are available. Okay, so you no longer need as many usings as you used to. Now, one other thing let's do this one first. So why does the namespace have a red squiggle underneath it? It's because, and this is another file I didn't mention up here within the solution space, it's called editor config. Does anybody use these? Yeah, a couple people. To edit them is not fun. There is actually, if I double click on this, well, I have it set so that it's actually showing me the text version of this. There is a way in Visual Studio, and I think this is by default, it's just I turned it off. I can say open with, and then there is a editor config designer, and I can say open it that way, and then I can do all sorts of changing to the file based on code styles and preferences I want. So you can do that if you want. But this editor config says for everything in the solution and projects, for example, I personally like tabs. If you like spaces, you're wrong, just to let you know, okay? But I like tabs. And what this does is it says, even if you're using an editor that says default should be spaces, all the code in here will be tabs. Now that's a simplistic thing, okay? But you can see there's a whole lot of other stuff in here that I've defined, like for initializers, for using tuples, for down here, I think, yeah, for vars, because I personally like to type in vars and not have to type in a whole type name and waste time doing that all the time. But you might like that. You might like to waste time and have the type name, by the variable. It's Vegas, everything goes, right? So maybe you want all these to be false, but you can enforce that in the editor config. Okay. By the way, I love showing this to people. If you really want to mess with people on your team, do this one trick. I got to do I have to do the YouTube thing like that, okay? That works, okay? You know what it does do though? It really breaks everything. The reason why this works is because var is a conditional keyword, because it was introduced in C# 3. And so before C# 3, var was a word you could use to define a type if you really wanted to, okay? And they have to honor that for backwards compatibility. So if you don't like var, go into your editor config and set it so that people have to use the type name. Please don't use this, because that's just messy. but it's also fun to play on people. There's a new feature in C# 14 where we've had this automated properties things where you can just say like public string name get set, and what actually is in the compiler is it will make a backing field for you for that property that has some weird name that you can't reference, but it's there because the property still needs a backing field. But in certain cases, you might have wanted to have access to that field for the getter or the setter or the emitter. And so you would then have to create your own backing field and do it that way. In C# 14, they now have a keyword field. And that refers to the backing field that is made. So if you need access to that, you can just say field, and that will access the backing field. What happens if you were a farmer creating agricultural software that used the word field? Now you've got a collision, right? So that's one thing that they were really cautious about this feature, because there was valid collisions that were going to happen in certain pieces of software. One of the things too that they're also doing with anything in C# from this point on is there's a code analysis rule. That's again why I mentioned doing that basically yells at you if you ever use all lowercase to define a type, because all keywords are lowercase. And so what that does is that starts to prevent people from actually end up using lowercase things that could turn into a keyword later on. Okay? So back to the point here is, why is this a red squiggle? It's because I want to use something called file scope namespaces. So if I say, hey, change that into a file scope namespace for me, it does that, and I'm going to reformat my document, and you saw everything moved over. Does this make my code faster? No, not at all. This is purely aesthetic. And in fact, there's some things that I'm showing you here that are just for aesthetics, but it makes my code more concise. It gets rid of noise. It gets rid of spacing that I don't need anymore. Okay, so this is saying that everything after this line is all within this namespace. Okay? And you don't have to do this. You don't have to change all this. I personally like it. I find this to be a little bit nicer of a way to declare a namespace. Okay? So that's another thing you can do. Now, if you're noticing, it might be a little hard, so I'll zoom into this so you can see it. Under person, you can see these like little, I'll go in even farther, these little gray dots under person. Now this is a Visual Studio thing. The team for Visual Studio calls these smudges. That's really cute, isn't it? It's a little smudge in your code. It's just like a little indicator, visual indicator to say, hey, you might want to change your code to something there, but you really don't have to. It's totally up to you. There's no yes or no to this, okay? What this is, so watch for those. If you're in VS, just look for those and then do the thing where you're clicking on it and you do control period, because it's like, well, what is it actually telling me to do? In this case, that smudge is there because it wants me to use something called a primary constructor, okay? So this is a new feature that was added. I don't remember, it's 12. Okay, so version 12 is when primary constructors were added. And if I would use it, it ends up looking like this. And I'll zoom back out. Okay, because that's like the primary constructor, so it puts those there. I'm going to back it out because I don't like them. You can use primary constructors if you like. I have personally found them to be kind of painful for various reasons. So that's why I don't really demo them, because I don't want people to use them, even though people in the C# team are like, yeah, you can use primary constructors. I found them to be, I'll get to your question in a moment. I found them just to be painful in certain scenarios of things I'm doing with code. And quite frankly, I'm just like, no, I don't care for that feature. But that's the cool thing about C#. You don't have to use all of the new features, right? You had a question? The properties map, yes. I'll talk about records because records almost look exactly the same thing. But yes, and I hesitate to say that because I'm not 100% sure, because I don't use primary constructors. Because in part of that problem of how do they actually map to properties and that type of thing. So that's one of the main reasons I don't like primary constructors, okay? So, but watch for the smudges. Another thing you can do here is use something called tuples. So tuples were added so that you could have a type that was basically a container of multiple values. Okay? And primarily you would do that if you had a method. You don't have to use it for just this. This is why all these features are nice, because you can use them in more places than was originally designed. Okay? So if I had a method that, let's say I wanted to return both the name and the age, it's telling me to deconstruct it. Yeah, go away. Deconstruction is a whole different thing. But let's say get values, okay? And I'm going to stop there because GitHub is being annoying. But you see here, this allows me to return multiple values from a method, which could be cool. Haven't had that for a while. Python's had that forever. So now C# has that. You can do that with tuples. But you can also use tuples if I want to do something like this. And I don't think I'll get I don't get a refactoring for it. But what I'm going to do is say this.id, this.name, this.age, and thank you. You actually did a good job. Why am I thanking a computer? What? Yeah, I'll get to that in a moment. It's not because of tuples, but it's something else. But it's like when people do GitHub prompts, they're like, please, please, pretty please do this for me. I'm like, no, it's a tool. It's not a human. Just say, do this. Okay. Is it okay to curse at it? I don't know. Give it a try. So, I want to be really nice to humans. I don't want to be nice to computers. They don't deserve it. So why is there a squiggle though? I'll get to that. The tuple there is basically saying I want this tuple assignment to be equal to those values. This is just a more concise way than assigning all those on one line apiece. It does exactly the same thing. But this is a cool way that and at least I find it cool, and I do this all the time with my constructors for assignments. I'll use tuple syntax to do it because it does the same thing and it's less code. Now you say, why is there a squiggle there? There's a squiggle there because in my editor config, I like using expression-bodied members. Expression-bodied members was a feature that was this actually goes right into my next, I got like a list here to make sure I don't miss anything, and that's right on the list, next one, because people ask that question. Why did that now become a squiggle there? It's because expression-bodied members, which what that is saying if my code in a member, like a property, an indexer, a method, essentially, if you can think about it, does one thing. I can change this to have the syntax look like this. Okay. Now that is not a lambda, that is not a delegate. All that's saying is I don't need to have a code block. That's it. But I personally find this a little bit more readable in this case. So maybe you don't. So then you wouldn't use expression body members. But this gets rid of a little bit more code for me. Okay? So that's why there was a squiggle there. Okay? All right, next thing on the list is the toString there, because there's squiggles there. In part, it's because we're returning. We didn't make this an expression body member. So before I forget, well, actually I could do it here, but I'm not going to. I'm going to wait until I show you the other thing. Okay? So this is using what's called a literal string. So a literal string is the @ sign there, and then everything after it is literally what's in that string content. So if I wanted to have a multi-line string in C#, this was one way to do it. The problem is that the indentation looks crappy, right? Because now I have to have everything over on the left side of the code to show that this should be all the way to the left side of the string. I'd like it to actually be over here, because that would read better, but that's not the way a literal string works, okay? There's now something in C#, and this is called raw string literals. And they were introduced in C# 11. So I'm going to zoom in on this because I want to point this out. If you see, whoops, don't move the mouse, Jason. If you see this red squiggle show up, and you want Visual Studio to change it for you to a raw string literal, but my character is on return, notice that I don't get that option. What you need to do is make sure that now it will pop in, convert to raw string literal. Okay. So where your cursor is in your code matters in terms of what refactorings and things Visual Studio will offer up for that code. So let's zoom back out. I will say, yes, make it a raw string literal. And you didn't do it. Very good, Visual Studio. You deserve a gold star. I will do it manually because you suck. So it's triple quotes, double triple quotes. 1, 2, 3, 4. Although that doesn't matter. I'll explain that in a moment. So then we'll move this over here, and then we'll move this over down here, and we'll do that. And now I will make an expression body member. And then, because I don't like that formatting either, I'm a little picky with where things are in code. Maybe you are too, but you know, I like things a certain way. There, now that's what I wanted. That is a raw string literal, yes. Does it put a new line before name? Nope. So what this is 3 lines in your string, okay? So this is actually, the more you get into a raw string literal, it's funny because it is extremely flexible. In some ways, I almost wish they would have done this out of the box because you can make a raw string literal, and I'll just put it in this method here. I can say var data is equal to ABC. And that is a string with 1 line, okay? That works. It doesn't have to be multi-line. It's a literal string of whatever content you have in here. The nice thing about a raw string literal is that the indentation starts effectively where this ending thing starts, I think. I always just put them all on the same line so that I don't have to think about it. Yeah. But that just reads and it looks better. And you can do interpolation with them. As you see here, it's got the $sign in front, so it's a raw interpolated raw string, I think is the exact way to say it. Yeah. Oh, there is here, yes. These are 3 lines in the string. Yep. With, I think it's RN for line feed characters or whatever those characters actually are. But these are the 3 lines. Okay. And this is helpful if I'm doing something like source generators, which I'll talk about later on. Because if I'm actually emitting code, to put them in a raw string literal is actually really nice. And you never have to worry about escaping anything ever again. Let's say, for whatever reason would possess me, that I wanted to have 3 double quotes around the ID here, the value. So what I wanted to be literally printed out are these 3 double quotes. Well, that obviously breaks everything, right? No. You just put another double quote at the front and the bottom. Oh, and then I need one here. There. And why didn't that work? Oh, yes. So, sorry. Either I did that or it did that. But thank you. I love people debugging for me. Okay, cool. There, that's what I meant to show. So I win. If I wanted to make this 4 double quotes, how do you think I win this time? Well, first, I put 5 there. Or I think 3 would work as well, because actually, would it? I don't know if it actually would do that. No, it doesn't. You have to have more than what's in the string. Yeah. So the whole point is I win. You always win. Can I put this many in there? God, we're getting ridiculous, but hey, it's Vegas. Whoops. There we can do that. Yep, that works. Why? I don't know, but you can. If I wanted to have literal, this is getting insane, but this actually, if I'm trying to put C# code in a literal string, this is so helpful. I can say, and I am also doing interpolation, so I'm trying to fill in holes. So let's say I actually wanted a single one here. Well, now that screws everything up. But what I can do is put a double $sign and then make these double here. And that works. And now this is literally a curly brace that will show up in the string. Okay? Raw strings are extremely flexible. If you're doing multi-line strings, change them all to raw strings. Okay? Even if you don't need 20 double quotes, just do it. They're so much better. Okay? Now I have to Control Z my life because I want to get rid of all this stupid nonsense I was doing. Okay, I think that's good. There we go. Okay. Your question wasn't nonsense. It was me accepting the nonsense and answering your questions. Okay, so raw string literals. The next one is switch statements like this. Okay, this isn't a switch statement. This is an if, else, if, but it kind of feels like a switch, right? So the age of the person, I want to get a descriptor for that age. And personally, I find this a little bit hard to read. Okay? Now, I could use a switch, which has been around in C# forever, that feels like the old C switch days. In fact, they literally copied that pretty much from C, which is awful, but they did that. Well, we have a better way now. We have switch expressions. So if I just do a dot here and I say convert to switch expression, boom. And of course, it's not an expression body member, so we'll change that. And I don't like where that is, so I'm going to move this all over because that's what I like to do. But that's it now, exact same code. So this switch expression basically says, whatever I have on the left here, it can be a string, it can be an object of some type, a person itself, it could be an enumeration, doesn't matter. It's saying, with that value, do a switch, and then I can do all sorts of pattern matching on it. And pattern matching is a whole topic in and of itself. But you notice here I can say, if the age is greater than or equal to 0, and why doesn't it make this here? Long and short is the C# team said that was going to break so much with parsing and double ands that they decided, no, we're going to have a literal word and or in there, okay, to do the pattern matching. So I can say this and this, now it's an infit, and so on, and I can always have it. In fact, if I don't have the default case here, it's going to yell at me. You see switch now has a red squiggle underneath it, and it's telling me that the switch expression is not handling all possible values. That's really cool. Okay. If I forgot that if somebody was over 110 years old, first, sorry for that. Second, I now have a way to say yes for any other case that you ran into, that's the default. Okay. So switch expressions, they're awesome. And I didn't have to think about how do I actually convert that. I can just say, hey, I've got this big if, else, if, or I already have a switch expression. See if Visual Studio can just change it for me. It's lazy, but it also is effective. Yes, you had a question. I love it when somebody asks me this. What character nonsense are you showing here, Jason? This thing is what you're getting at, right? Yeah. What? Oh, this arrow thing, yeah. Jason, what are you doing to do that? This is a ligature in the font. What this actually is, and I'll drop in the visual, do I have VS Code open? No, I don't. Let me go back and open that up. Because I don't think it will show here if I do like a new file. I don't care about your release notes, go away. If I do like a equals greater than, you see it actually did it here. Those are still 2 characters. If I use a different font, you'll see the normal equals greater than, okay? But this is using Cascadia code, which is I love it. But it does throw people if they've never seen this before, because this is literally just the greater than or equal, or equal greater than. It's just showing you as one symbol. Yeah. Yes. What? Is it a plugin? No, in fact, it's in Visual Studio. You just have to go to your fonts and find it. But it should be Cascadia code. In fact, another thing in Visual Studio, I'm running out of time, but I love this stuff. Another thing in Visual Studio, Control, comma, will bring this up. This is great if you want to search for anything in your code, or if you want to search for features, okay? Like fonts and colors. So I can just type that in, and it will now give me that as the option, and I can just hit that, and now it should go to this. And that's, as you can see here, it's Cascadia code. Okay? No, I'm not going to change it to Wingding, sorry. I know, you're all depressed. Buy me a beer later and I might do it. So those are switch expressions. The next one is this parse, try, parse. So since C# 1.0, if you've ever seen on a lot of the numeric types, int.parse, double.parse. So I can give it a string and it would parse it. Okay. Then in C# 2.0, the recommended approach was to use a try parse. Because if it didn't parse, it threw an exception. And throwing exceptions is expensive from a performance standpoint. You might not see it, but if you do control flow in your applications using exceptions, it sucks. Exceptions are not cheap to make. So what they did is this try parse thing where I have an out value, and only if it parses and returns true will this value be valid. If it's false, what's in here is untrusted. It'll probably just be a blank string in this case, okay, but it didn't work. So if you do a try parse, that's the recommended approach now for handling try parse. The thing about all this though is that this is not enforced from like a compiler standpoint. These are just methods that by convention you should follow. Except now we can. So if I go back up to and yes, why is this here? We'll get to that in a moment. But if I go back, at some point I'm just going to grab the code that it should be in because I run out of time, and I'll just be like, here's all the changes. But if I say here, I parsable of person, okay? And now it's saying, well, Jason, you're not actually implementing that correctly. So I'll say, implement it for me. Okay? And now this is where I have these two methods down here. And because I am running out of time, I'm going to take what it actually should be and cheat and grab all this to what it really should be, and then come back over here. And I'm going to take these methods away that I just added manually, or that were here before, and now put in the implementation for that interface. Now, you might be saying, those are static methods. How does that work with an interface? Well, if I click on parsable here and say, go to definition, you'll notice that now this is one that's in .NET, but this is not limited to .NET. You can define interfaces this way if you want now. I can have a static abstract member on my interface. So we could do a whole talk in interfaces that they are not just member definitions that you have to implement anymore. They can have different accessibility and visibility. They can also have static members on them. And now they can have static abstract members on them. And why this is so powerful and so important is, for one, it now makes this pattern enforceable by an interface. This type now implements parse and try parse with the right values. You notice there's now a format provider on the end here, which is what you should do. And that comes from that interface defining it that way. Okay? You'll also notice that I had this in the code that I was calling split on the string like I am here, but it had a squiggle on it. That's because I have nullable enabled in my code. Nullable reference types. If you don't have that on, I would highly recommend turning it on, because it can catch things like, hey, you tried to call something on a reference type that might have been passed to you as null. And the way to make the compiler happy is to add, just in this case, a null check. And then it will make sure that it will either throw that, but now it knows from a compiler analysis standpoint, yes, this cannot be null after this point. Yeah. So really cool in checking some of the things that are potentially null in your code. And a whole talk on nullable could go for quite a long time. But turn that on if you don't have that turned on right now. That's nullable in your build props file, and you set that to true. Okay. The other case where this becomes really interesting is with operator overloading. Okay. Yes, let's make this an expression body member, and we'll put that here. Okay. This is just saying I want to add two people together. Now, how you would do that, it's just, in this case, I'm just saying, hey, it has a new identifier, and we're just combining the two names together, and we're assuming it's like a new child. So it's like, hey, somebody had a baby. Woohoo, okay, stupid, but it works. The point is that this is adding two people together, as the add operator has always worked. But what I can do is also put in a interface called iAddition operators for person, all of them, and nothing changed. It's still fine, but it's because if I go to the definition of this type, and you'll see that you can also now have static abstract operators defined on an interface. And this is very powerful because now you can have extension methods that have types that are constrained to something like iAddition operators, so you can add anything together, not just numeric types. It really makes things a lot more flexible with the type system in C#. Okay. All right, so we have a couple more things to change in this real quick. You'll notice that there is a smudge here. And it's saying that the new expression can be simplified. You can basically change it to this. So if it can infer what the new thing is that you're making, it's doing that because the return type is person here. It's saying you don't have to say new person. You can just say new and then give the constructor. And it knows you're making a person. Be a little cautious with this, mostly for readability. If you are going to new up something and then the things you're passing into the constructor are also being newed up and it's taking new things in there, you're going to see new, and you're going to have no idea what the hell your code does. Okay? So be careful with that. Be a little cautious with putting there's nothing wrong with it. It just can make things potentially unreadable. It's really nice though when you're declaring a field to a new value. Like if you have private read-only string name equals something, a new name thing, whatever, you can now just say new and you don't have to put the rest of the type name there because it knows it from the field what type it is. So that's a nice place where you can do it. Okay. The last thing is, and I'm just going to grab the whole ending point at this point, is because if you're looking at this, you might go, that's a lot of stuff for me to define. I've got to have the toString here and other things, and I got to have my properties down here. There's a new type, which really isn't a type per se, but it's called a record. And so if I grab all this and put that in here, I think that should work. Yes. So now we have a record. And what this record does is it's saying I have three properties, read-only, it's immutable by default, ID, name, and age, and it implements equality for you, it does deconstruction for you, it does all these things for you. So you can use, I use records a lot if I'm just having some kind of like little data object that I don't want to have people change. They're much easier than creating your own like DTOs or things like that. I would highly recommend using a record in place of that. And if I look at the size of these two starting and endpoints, like this is what, this is about like, we'll say 90 lines of code. And again, lines of code is not necessarily like smaller is better or anything like that, but 90 compared to what, 60 now. So it's also less code that I have to see because I'm letting the compiler do things for me that I didn't have to define in the first place. Okay. All right, couple last things to talk about real quick is, let's say that I wanted to find a person using some kind of service, okay? And this is a simplistic pattern you might have seen in your code where you have a service that uses some other things that will actually go off and get the stuff for you. So I'm passing in a repository here, and in the getter, I want to actually use the repository's retrieve. Now, why can't you find that? Oh, I know why, because, hold on. I messed that up. I forgot to change the namespace here. Boom. Now you know what it is, right? You should. Yes, you do. Good. Visual Studio only took like 10 seconds to do that. Okay, so I want to have this thing passed into it that's going to do a retrieve. Now, if you've ever wanted to test this, you might go, well, do I actually need to pass in the real service that talks to the database to do this? No, you don't have to. You can create like a stub or a mock of it that does it for you. You may have heard of libraries that you can use to do this called MLQ or NSubstitute. Anybody use those in their tests? Who writes tests in this? All you raise your hands. Because you all should write tests, right? So I have a whole talk on tests. I'm a big advocate about having tests in your code because it saves so much of your sanity. But in this case, what I might want to do if I'm writing a test is instead of passing in a real implementation of it, pass in a mock, use something like MLQ. I've written something called rocks, which is almost exactly the same as those other libraries, except it uses a feature in C# called the source generator. Okay? So in this test, you'll see that I have this iPerson repository create expectations. This is a type that rocks will generate because Up here, I have defined this attribute to say, I want my library to create stuff that allows me to mock this type. So then what I can do is say, I expect retrieve to be called with that ID, and then it's going to return that person for me. Okay. So then when I test the service, I call get, I'm passing in the ID, which is going to pass it into here. I'm going to return the value. I can assert that this is all equal, and I can verify my expectations. Now, the nice thing about all this is if I say F12, this is all the code that my library is generating. Now, do you need to know all this? No, that's not why I'm showing you this. The point of why I'm showing you this is because this is something called a source generator. You can build your own source generators in your own applications if you'd like. It's not easy. There is a learning curve here because source generators require you to understand syntax trees, semantic models, and all that fun stuff that Roslyn has available for you, okay? But if you're interested, you can say, hey, I can find this in my code, and based on the existence of like an attribute in my code, I can now go off and generate all of this code that I don't need to write by hand. And I can do it at compile time. That's another kicker. If you use libraries like AutoMapper, which does mapping from one object to another, that has always been done at runtime using reflection. And that could be a source of pain, depending upon what you did or what you didn't do. Same thing with mock, and MOQ, and then substitute. They generate all this code at runtime. I'm generating this as compiled code that gets compiled into my assembly, and if I wanted to do ahead of time generation, AOT compilation, this also works really well. Reflection does not work well with AOT at all. And if the internet is nice, what you can also get, if you're using a source generator, just using a source generator does not mean that your code is going to suddenly be faster, because you can generate really bad code too. I mean, that's totally possible. But there is a repository out there called Benchmark MockNet, not .NET. That's an awesome one for performance. But this is what somebody wrote to compare all the mocking frameworks and their speed to one another. And I added mine to it a couple years ago. And yes, this is a little patting on my back, but I take a little pride in this. If you look at, compared to MOQ and then substitute and compare it to rocks, if you look at all the different tests here for like construction, setting up a return value, doing like a one parameter method that you want to mock up. For example, here, rocks is consistently faster than all of them. And it also consumes typically an order or two magnitude less of memory. Now this is just bytes. This is not like gigabytes. But still, because I can do all these optimizations and all these things in my code, and it's in C#, to debug this has been much easier than anything I would have ever had to do with something like MOQ. Okay? So I bring this up as a feature just to keep in the back of your head and go, maybe there's something that I can do in my code base that I always do by hand, or I'm doing it with reflection. Maybe a source generator can give me some perf improvements and make things easier for me as a developer that I don't have to write all that myself. Let's go into my application, and I have a program here which I'm not going to run, just shows you that you can add these people together because I have the add operation. So I have an add method down here which is constrained to this addition operator. So any type that implements this, I can add them together now. So up here you can see I can do an add of two people and get that result, which is pretty cool. Okay. But let's say I added some extension methods. We all make extension methods that if we have a type that we can't change for whatever reason, we don't own it, we don't want to break any inheritance things, so we create these extension methods. And I might have something like this. Okay? You've probably seen something like this. You probably defined extension methods this way. Well, there's a new way to do extension methods. And why should I write that myself? Visual Studio, do it for me. Okay? So zoom in, you'll see it says, convert this to extension. And I say, sure. That's the new hotness. Okay? So if you want to create extensions, now what you can use, move this over a little bit, is this extension keyword. So what it's saying here is, this is extending an instance of person. And now notice that the describe age better is no longer static. It's an instance, and there's no this parameter being passed in as the first one, because this is this value that you're extending. Okay? But it gets better. In fact, I'm just going to cut to the chase and copy some of my code that does some more things with extensions that you can see. So let's just copy pasta. I can have extension properties. I can do that now. Both instance and static. You can now have static members. So if I extend the static, or if I extend the person type, I can now have a static create method on that person class. And that works just as fine. So you can now, with this new extension keyword, you can extend instances with properties and methods and types with static properties and methods. Okay? This is pretty cool. This is a nice addition that they put. Extension everything has been added, has been asked for in C# for many, many years. And while this doesn't extend everything, this does give you the starting point to now saying, I can not only do the traditional extending methods, but I can now add in properties. And I can also do generics, like if I wanted to say extension of T, where I have T thing, where T, blah, 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 I can do that too. That's perfectly fine. So, what was it doing? Oh, okay. I was just typing in garbage. So, but that's a new feature that was just added in 14. Very, very powerful. All right, I got a couple more minutes. Any more questions? Nope. Yeah, go ahead. I have a talk in testing. Do I have that anywhere? Yeah, well, the code for that is, if you look at my organization, like github.com/jasonbock, there should be a repository in there called testability. The slides, I also have a repository called presentations, and I might have a PDF version of it there, maybe. Okay. If you really want to see it, tell the organizers I want to see Jason Bock do a testability talk again in the future. I'd appreciate that. But that's where you can find that stuff. Okay, so to wrap things up, and just to recap real quick, here's some features we talked about with those files, those props files, and other things you can use now in your projects and solutions that I highly recommend you do. Here's all the features that I mentioned. Obviously, this is not all of them, but some that I found really, really useful that you can now do things very succinctly in your code and be more expressive. I didn't even talk about collection expressions, where you can now have not the curly braces, but the array block thingies on the left. I forget the character name for them. But you can now use that to assign a collection to those values. And that's much more expressive when you want to pass that in to a method that takes like a list or an array or something else like that. You can use that succinct syntax to pass those values in. So lots of new stuff that's in C#. The thing to keep in mind as you're moving into the future, first, what's the roadmap? Where is C# going to go from here? It's not going to change. The pace is always going to be in November. We're going to get a new version of C#. This is the way it's been now for like 5, 6, 7, 6, 7. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Boo. Why are my reviews all 1 stars? I don't know. So it's because you can't have 6 or 7 stars, see? Okay, I'm going to stop. Every year we're getting in November a new version of C# and .NET. That cadence is not going to change. In fact, here is the last time I checked, there's a site that they maintain about things that they're working on called the working set. That's the new things that they might. This is not set in stone. This is still might. They can pull things. They've done that in the past where they put things in preview versions and then they realize it just isn't ready yet and they'll pull it out. Okay, so do not take this as set in stone. One thing that people see here that they actually will go, woohoo, is unions. Unions have been asked for in C# for God knows how long, and they are finally coming. Okay? If at least in an experimental state, but they are coming. Okay? Just like winter. You'll see in there extension indexers. I said it's not extension everything. It's because they wanted to get a core set of members for this new extension feature done, and then look at what they could add in the future. So they're looking at adding extension indexers. Maybe they add in extension constructors in the future, who knows? But that's another thing they're looking at to add in 15. Runtime async, this is a low-level detail, but whenever you've done await and async in your code, what the C# compiler does is create this really gnarly looking state machine. If you've ever like decompiled your code and looked at it using ILSpy or something like that, there's all this code that the compiler generates to handle the asynchronous nature of your code, and that's some overhead. What they're now looking at doing is moving all of that into the runtime so that your code doesn't change. You write await async, it still works, but the performance is potentially going to get much, much better with this new feature being added in, along with some other stuff. So again, study is needed. Need to keep up on this stuff, especially with, and I had to put this slide in here, this thing, okay? Because some people, like I'd ask, are you C# developers? I bet a lot of people raise their hands. I'm like, who's a Markdown developer in here now? Who's just writing prompts and everything's done with AI and I don't have to look at any of my code anymore? Okay. I mean, that's kind of the way sometimes it feels like that's the way the world is moving. And yes, I mean, I use this stuff to say, hey, I got this new code here. Can you generate some tests for it? Wait a minute, let me rephrase that. I've got some new code here. Generate tests for me, right? Don't need to be, don't say please, just do it, okay? Every time you say please, you kill a tree. Okay, so you said it, not me. So, I mean, yes, this stuff is an assistant, it's a tool, and it helps. It's also, you know, we can have all these opinions about AI, but from a language perspective, I think it's still important to know what features exist, where and why they're there, what they do. Even if you're having something, whether it was AI or you had a template tool to generate all this stuff for you, at some point, unless we don't take heed to what Arnold Schwarzenegger said in Terminator 2 about taking humans out of the loop, and what did we get? Skynet. Okay. Humans still have to be in the loop at some point at the end of the day. So knowing what is available that you can change and maintain that code over time is still, to me, as somebody who loves programming languages, I still find that to be important, okay? And there are some features that are in C# that are low level. These are some of them that I've seen that I would probably bet you, because again, we're in Vegas, so I would bet you probably will never use any of these. Maybe some of you will. But these are for very specific cases, valid cases that in some places are there to make performance just a tiny bit better in high performance scenarios where something's being called over and over and over and over and over again. You may want to use one of these features, but it's not something that you'd have to do in every piece of your code, okay? It's a balance. Like there are some features I think that are very helpful and useful that you want to use in C#, especially new ones that can make your code a little bit easier potentially to read and maintain over time. And then there are some that are very esoteric and may not be very beneficial, but especially in that one little case might be helpful to know in the back of your head, hey, this thing exists, this might help in the future. Okay, I am done. Thank you for coming.